Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmussen speaking. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. Today's topic is whether you can be hypnotized against your will. So, can you be hypnotized against your will? And is hypnosis a form of mind control? And can a hypnotist or hypnotherapist make you act against your own values or get you to do something that you otherwise wouldn't do? These are interesting questions. So here's my take. First of all, people act against their values or their professed values pretty much every day. If you know someone who has cheated on their diet, for example, someone who has sworn to not eat certain things or to give up cigarettes or to no longer drink alcohol or abuse drugs, and then they go do it after all, that person is acting against their verbally stated values, at least. Now, you might make a point that human beings are complex, psychosocial beings who have a lot of contradictory values and agendas and goals, and I completely agree. But my point is that most of us act against our values and our stated priorities much of the time. And there's also a question of, I have no doubt that some people have a better ethical compass than others, that some people walk their talk more than others. I think there's a scale. There are some people who are very ethical, and there's people with virtually no conscience. Some people have a lot of self-reflection going on. Some people have relatively little. But still, having said that, we are largely strangers to ourselves. If you ask someone, why do you do the things you do, they will invent an answer. These answers will very often have very little to do with the actual factors at play. The question becomes, does the person realize this or not? So if somebody asks you, why did you do that? The most honest answer will probably be, I don't know. It's probably not smart to say that in most of life's contexts, unless you're dealing with a philosopher or someone who's very psychologically inclined, who knows that is likely the most correct answer, that we are strangers to ourselves. Most people will hear a person without self-reflection or a person who somehow is incompetent or perhaps immoral. Now, a very interesting point to make here is for a lot of people, their verbally stated values and goals might have quite to do with virtual signaling, how they wish to be perceived. So there's a fascinating experiment where you had a bunch of priests who were going to deliver a talk about compassion and care. And this was, of course, a social psychology experiment where the priests were kind of being tricked. And on the way to the church to give the talk, there was this person lying in the streets. And the question was, would the priest help the person, or would they kind of step over the corpse, so to speak? And what the researchers discovered was that it was not their verbally stated values that seemed to determine whether they did so or not, because everybody claimed, the talk was on compassion and helping the needy. So what they discovered was that if they told the priest that, hey, we have plenty of time, but let's just get moving. If the priest had the perception that he had plenty of time, most of them, not all, but most of them actually stopped to help the needy bastard, so to speak. But if they were told, hey, by the way, we're late, we really got to hurry, let's get going. If they had the perception that they were late, most of them would in fact not stop. Now, when priests and others have been asked, why did you stop or would you stop? Virtually no one brings up such a reason as the variable. So this is important to keep in mind also in terms of hypnosis. We are still largely strangers to ourselves. We can't really predict what's cooking in someone else's psyche with any sense of accuracy, much less our own. It is, however, a kind of protected setting in some ways, in that you have a contract with someone where you're essentially writing a contract saying, I consent for you in this whole context and encounter to influence me because I want to make some sort of change in my life, or I want to be a participant on stage during a stage hypnosis show. People might still do weird stuff, but a big argument for those who believe that hypnosis is a form of mind control, or that you can be so-called hypnotized against your will. By the way, will has very little to do with it. The neurological mechanisms between will are markedly different from the neurological mechanisms behind thought and action. So again, the whole question is essentially a non-starter. But let's say that you, as a hypnotherapist or stage hypnotist or street performer, let's say that you guide someone to experience their hand stuck to the table, and you then suggest that the more you try to remove your hand, the more you will find that it's impossible, it's stuck. Now, let's say that the person has a convincing experience of that being the case. See? I suggested that he couldn't raise his butt off the chair, and now he's stuck to the chair. Or I suggested that his name was gone, and now he can't say or can't remember his name. That proves that hypnosis is mind control, and I hypnotized him against his will. No, it doesn't. Not upon some careful reflection. The person is making meaning. Remember this. The person who's listening in any encounter is as active a part of the encounter as the person who's talking. So the person is on some level thinking that their hand is stuck to the table. And furthermore, they are thinking that the more they try to lift it, the more it will be stuck. So the fact that they think this does not mean that the hypnotist caused it or has special powers. Think about it. Carefully consider it. Now, of course, the idea that all hypnosis is self-hypnosis is also a somewhat inaccurate way of thinking about it, because if you have more than one person in an encounter, it seems unreasonable to attribute the outcome entirely to one person in that encounter. Of course, we create meaning. We experience our own thought-generated simulations of what our minds think is going on, both externally and internally. But if you, for example, as a psychologist or hypnotherapist, if you were to believe in repressed memories, for example, and if you were to believe that certain symptoms are indicative of sexual abuse, I'm referring to the memory wars of the 80s and 90s, and let's say that you offer a lot of leading questions and suggestions and implications of repressed abuse, and let's say that someone now remembers abuse very convincingly, and they end up in court and they accuse their father, and the father goes to jail, for example, for this, which tragically has happened in countless cases. If you then, as the therapist, were to take a step back and say, all hypnosis is self-hypnosis, that shouldn't really fly. That shouldn't really fly. You have to acknowledge that you have some responsibility for the frameworks, the context, and the types of suggestions that you're offering. If you're doing that in a mutually consented context where the person is searching for change or meaning or truth, if you're part of that process and the process goes wrong in the case of people remembering abuse which never happened or something like that, you can't then step back and say all hypnosis is entirely self-hypnosis. This is not an intellectually honest position to take. So I think a reasonable, rational approach to take is to say, look, what happens in this hypnotic encounter, the person's own memories, expectations, values, motives, so on and so forth, are a huge part of it. The client is creating his own hypnotic experience in that sense. You, as the agents of change or hypnotists, your state, your congruence, your ability to read nonverbal cues, your framing, your suggestions, is part of the process. And the authority, the social conventions, the context, the cultural surround, all of this stuff also influences what actually turns out as a response in the client. So for example, today very few people discover so-called multiple personalities. There are less people today who discover abuse which never happened because the culture has changed. People are being educated in somewhat different ways. So anyways, these are my some of my reflections on the topic. Hope this was food for thought, and until next time, enjoy.